Fear. It's the largest grossing industry in America. What if I told you that our drive for fear creates a disconnect between horror and the things that are truly evil? That's the hypothesis of Professor Keith Fallows. He joins me tonight to talk about those issues and more. That's all coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm Sam Chen. Fear is one of the highest grossing industries in the United States and around the world. We have many ways, holidays dedicated to it. Halloween. We have amusement park rides that are dedicated to the thrill and the fear that many get. And of course, an entire genre in literature and film. But what if fear's drive towards horror actually creates a disconnect with things that are truly evil or things that are realities for us in everyday life? Well, that's the hypothesis behind the research of Keith Fallows, adjunct professor of English at Northampton Community College. He joins us tonight to talk about just that. Keith, welcome to Face the Issues.
I'm happy to be here, Sam.
It's good to have you.
I'm glad.
I wanted to talk about, you have a very, very interesting hypothesis that you're proposing. And
right.
You gave a talk recently, and this is how you explained it. You said the horror genre has the ability to exploit fact and create fictional stories. Though demons, zombies, ghosts, and so on largely exist only in our imagination, when horror uses them as villains, as opposed to those who do exist, such as psychopaths and Nazis, these monsters usually represent both the purposely ignored happenings throughout history and the contemporary. Seems to me that you're drawing a distinction. When you talk about the idea of fear, you're drawing a distinction between things that may be in the horror genre that you're calling fictional and things that are actually evil and that we deal with every day, whether psychopaths, serial killers, human traffickers, Nazis, and so forth. Talk to me about that distinction.
Well, it's hard to explain off the top of your head, but it's actually, once you get past the surface level, you can kind of see what villain represents what. So, evil in real life, financial crises, mass homelessness, war. There's villains that represent those types of things. So zombies would be the first that comes to our mind because they're so embodying people on Black Friday outside Walmart, beating down doors, trying to get through. And it lets us think a little bit about capitalism, our situation, and not in a bad way, of course, just, okay, well, how much do we want to invest in wanting things, right? Because want is desire. Desire can lead to evil very fast, right?
Yeah.
Does that answer?
It does.
Good.
It does. And that's an interesting thing. So you're suggesting that these fictional stories, such as zombies, ghosts, and so forth, are actually rooted in real life evils.
Totally.
But we portray them as something that's fictional.
Right. They're a projection. When I say drive for fear, it's a projection of our fear into a controlled environment, one we have control over. Because when we're really feeling fear, we're in a situation that has become chaotic. There's no sense of order, and that loss of control, right, being able to handle where we're going to go is dangerous to us instinctually.
Are we projecting because we want control?
I think it's about, see, that's the hard part, because once you get to haunted houses, you're kind of signing a waiver letting people, they can't touch you unless you're in the extreme ones, but you are kind of giving up some control, but you know that if you say a certain word, you might be able to get out a safe word, right?
Sure.
But, so projecting it is, I think it's more of a way of expressing it, or what frightens us, and enjoy it. So replacing it with a sense of, rather than dread, but enjoy it and laugh about it with others if it's something absurd, right?
Sure, and you put it, to your point with the haunted houses, you almost put it into a context where you know there's boundaries to it.
Right.
I want to ask you about, well, first let me ask you about our seeming obsession with horror. It's an American thing, we have Halloween, but you've argued that this is something that's growing around the world.
It is. It was definitely uniquely American, and not only from the context of our free expression, First Amendment, but also scare tactics that the old Bible Belt used to use, like the, can I say hell houses?
Sure.
Hell houses were very frightening, very interesting. And to pretend that didn't influence Halloween as it is today, we can't. So it does have an Americana to it, but you see places like Japan, Tokyo, they cosplay every day. Mm-hmm. So Halloween, the embodiment of horror as a holiday and just kind of spread it out to different festivals. There's a lot of great Asian horror as far back as the 90s, but as far as haunted houses go and Halloween, I to the best of my knowledge, because I could be wrong, it's recent, but it is definitely expanding, especially with some lockdowns being lifted around the world.
Sure.
Right?
And along those lines, you said it is a projection of evil, and yet there's a distance, right, between the horrifying in our society and things that are evil.
Right.
Does our run to the horrifying, because there are definitely people who run toward the evil, right?
Yep.
But it's the exception in many ways, and so people run towards horror. Does that create a disconnect in your mind between what we might perceive as evil and what truly is?
Yeah, totally. You can think of what you just said, running toward, sometimes it's just a sense of helplessness. All we can do is, I can't help anyone. 9/11, for example. Sure. The least I can do is watch and endure the agonies of it as a community, right? Now, with people flipping out their phones, taking pictures of horrible things, that's evil, right? We can feel if inherent sense of justice, maybe anxiety, whatever. When we see someone doing that, it's a major collective, no, that's not all right. So, but when it's horror, when it's a TV show, movie, video game, no matter how intense it appears on the screen, it's fake, it's fiction, right? So it's enjoyable to do that and express ourselves in that manner. Whereas it's different than when we are going to view a disaster or take pictures of it for some sense of sadism, right?
So we watch something like, say, a police show or CSI, FBI, Law and Order, Special Victims, and what we see on the screen, we somehow aren't even squeamish about sometimes. Right. And yet, if you were to witness that in real life, they hit like a ton of bricks.
Mm-hmm. There's a line.
Right. Do you think, you brought up 9/11, Keith, and do you think, there's a former professor of mine, actually, Thomas Hibbs, who became president of the University of Dallas, had argued at one point that perhaps things like 9/11 hit us even harder because we have convinced ourselves that the horror that we deal in is true evil, which you've argued it's not. It's just in many ways, it's just a projection of it.
So he's talking about fiction.
Correct. Okay. And that in whether horror movies or literature, that we've convinced ourselves that this is true evil, then we witness something like September 11th. That happens all at once, it is sudden, but it is actual evil.
Right.
And it hits us even harder because we have spent so much time in these set parameters, as you described, that we almost lost the idea of what truly evil is. What do you think of that argument? What do you think of that?
I think it has a major flaw. The major flaw in it is that we're not ignoring horror by enjoying it. We're not ignoring evil. I'm sorry. True evil is not something we often see, right? There's levels to what we call evil or good, right? When we enjoy depictions of evil in a fictional environment or within boundaries, right? That's just for fun. It's no different than a Ferris wheel, really. It's just a little more extreme. But true evil itself, when we talk about things like 9/11, the Holocaust, these are all organized by a system of bureaucracy, and we live under that every day. Not in evil terms, but they can be turned evil. We are any form of administration that has existed throughout time can flip the switch. Collapse of civilizations usually takes thousands of years in the making, but it happens within 50. That actual fall of civilizations. So while 9/11 hit us I would say 9/11 did not hit us that as hard because we are invested in fiction and seeing depictions of evil there, but it's because true evil on such a display is very rare to see.
Okay, so you think that's why it hit us harder?
Yeah.
Let me ask you this: do you think there's a disconnect with our experience in the horror world with real world realities? I mean, we talked about things like 9/11, but you just mentioned the fact that these are systems that are in place and can be flipped, whether intentionally, like something like September 11th or the Holocaust, or oftentimes it's things that just occur, like a housing crisis or COVID-19 led, well, first of all, in its own way, horrifying, or a natural disaster.
Right.
But also leads to certain employment issues and depressions, economic recessions, and so forth. Things that we might not see as evil at face value. It's not someone that is attacking someone else,
right?
But still results in similar ends, if you will.
Right. Agony.
Is there agony? Is there a disconnect that is driven by our involvement in horror that isn't reflected in that?
Let me just try and clarify. You're asking me does horror mirror that completely?
Yeah, does it? And if it doesn't, then are we less able to deal with those realities when they come?
I would say no. It definitely does not mirror real agony as a result of evil or disaster. But as what I find is horror has made me much more empathetic, because oftentimes the heroes of horror films are victims of at some level. So when we see Exorcist, for example, the heroes of that film and the book that came before are Jesuit priests. They're trying to help this child who's just under a demonic possession, and it's horrifying, and especially in its time, no one had ever seen something like that before. But when you go back and watch it today, when we have such a level of division, at least how the media portrays it, it's good to see someone of the cloth in a heroic position. They just happen to be doing it in a really dark horror setting, but oftentimes Jesuits, for example, in this case, had gone on really dangerous missions to try and help people, and some of them died in that process. So it is The Exorcist. You can spin it or build up, look at it on a macro scale, and understand, okay, I see what they're talking about. It's like, sure, there's some issues with every different institution, from religion to government, but there's people in there that work very hard to keep people safe as well. So again, I think that empathetic message is present in most horror I witness or I watch.
So even, and to kind of summarize that, even if it is fiction, there is, I mean, to your point, and as an English professor, you would know this, fiction, even though, as we engage it, whatever we engage, does still impact and influence us.
Yeah, it does, in a good way. The line's thin, but it's there.
Yeah, that's a good note. Fascinating conversation. We're going to cut the break, but when we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about how evil has affected us as a society. So my guest is Keith Fallows. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Keith, thank you again for being with us. I want to shift our conversation from the genre of horror, if you will, our passion for fear. And we talked a lot about how much of true evil it mirrors.
Right.
And yet what impact it has on our society. I want to shift that now toward actually a question of evil in society.
Right.
We all know it exists, right?
Yeah.
We talked about the Holocaust, we talked about the events of September 11th. We all know that exists. You use the term agony, in that everyone, whether they go through something like a terrorist attack or they go through a natural disaster, they understand the idea of agony. And we almost say that as a part of life, that the human life is going to travel through agony. You've argued from a Hobbesian perspective, the writings of British political thinker Thomas Hobbes, that evil is inherent and permeated into this world, and perhaps humanity itself is inherently wicked, as Hobbes would write. Given that perspective, what do you make of our obsession with horror? Is that driven by the fact that we are, as Hobbes would say, humanity is inherently wicked?
Well, first I want to say, I think it's interesting you call it Hobbesian. I always say Hobbesian. So it's kind of funny to hear it differently. But yes, what that makes me think about horror's it's a drive, as we keep going back to this drive of human curiosity, because chaos is the default. Evil, cruelty, that is the default, right? We see often today people calling for anarchism. They actually have no idea how awful that would be, to live at the mercy of your neighbor, right? We're no longer friends. We live without anything that ties us, so why not? I kill you, take your food, right? So how horror manipulates that is it shows us the best and worst of our societies, from the level of an individual killer to dystopia, right? But the point is that we do have to build some structure to circumvent the state of nature, which is chaotic, and it's going to be flawed. And especially in a place like the United States, though, we're meant to call out these flaws, and horror does that.
I want to ask you so to your point, you're essentially arguing that horror almost drives us toward decency.
Yep, that's what I'm arguing. Nailed it.
So let me ask you this. There's obviously a counter view to Hobbes, which is that of John Locke and the French philosopher Baron de Montesquieu. And they argue that humanity isn't essentially wicked. Not that there aren't wicked people, that those people will always exist, but that by nature, the state of nature, as you talked about, humanity is selfish. So to use the example that you brought up earlier, that if there are no rules we play by, chaos still reigns. And this is something that they would agree on, Hobbes and Locke. Chaos still reigns, but your neighbor may kill you to take your food, not driven by a hatred of you, but driven by desire for your food.
Right.
That it's driven by selfishness. Does that change your argument? First of all, how do you respond to that, being a Hobbesian? But secondly, does that change the argument that a genre like horror actually in some ways drives us toward decency?
First, I'll say that you said desire, right? Because they desire food. What's desire? It's evil. Desire drives us to
I think Hobbes would argue that, but I think Locke would argue.
You said as a Hobbes out of it.
I think Locke would argue that desire itself is not wicked or good, right? That your desire for food is not a bad thing, because you need to eat or you will die, right? And so that desire itself is neutral. What the desire goes toward, Locke argues that our desires are selfish because they go towards ourself, and that selfishness often could lead to acts of wickedness, but doesn't have to, right? I think Hobbes will argue that it will always lead to acts of wickedness.
Right.
Right. Whichever argument you take, and this is a back and forth we can have all day.
Of course, definitely.
Does that change the perspective of what horror, the genre of horror, and our obsession with it? Does that change why we're so obsessed with it?
I still don't think so, because again, you mentioned that I just lost it with the Lockean perspective that we're selfish and desire is neutral because we have to eat, even if it drives us to kill. But the thing is, look at the institutions we have built in place, religion, for example. Most mainstream religions, even in that situation, don't kill somebody.
Correct.
Don't hurt them. But if I'm starving and my instinct is to be self-preserving, there's a level of pride to that.
Sure.
Pride is also evil, and by desire, right? Desire. So we can be neutral about desire to a certain point, but at some point we have to make the decision of, is this act of violence really necessary? Is my life superior to this person's? Because that's what I'm acting on if I'm going to kill him and take his food. That's
an interesting point. And I think in many ways it's a disagreement of semantics. The idea that it's how we define these terms, right?
Oh, totally.
And what Locke would define as or what I am defining as Lockean selfishness, perhaps you're defining as Hobbesian wickedness. But that does lead me to this question. We talked about this kind of obsession. You said it's really becoming a global obsession with the horrifying, and with fear, right? And so much of that, to your point in the first segment, is us being scared, but being scared within a certain parameter.
Right.
Do you think that shifts at all with the pattern, like we've seen in the world, whether it's September 11th or the Holocaust, but as we see these seemingly increasingly mortifying acts of wickedness, does that passion for horror, does that change at all? And does horror itself change at all?
I would say no to the first, yes to the second.
Okay.
And I'll elaborate on the second because I read recently, he's not a horror author, but Chuck Palahniuk, who wrote Fight Club. At the end of the film, it was before...
First rule.
The first rule of Fight Club, don't talk about Fight Club.
Oh, we're breaking the first rule, but go ahead.
But the end of the film, as if you've seen it, the skyscrapers are destroyed. That was pre 9/11. Chuck Palahniuk, he writes what they call transgressive fiction. It's like horror, but a little there's horror elements. But he said that since 9/11, transgressive fiction has been pretty quiet. And so I definitely think there is a moment of change in what we develop and show for a bit, for the sake of healing, right? Things of that nature. I mean, there's still people walking around who've been affected horribly by 9/11 and other incidents of recent periods. So, yeah, it does change now and then.
Is that our decency coming out?
I think so. And it's also allowing the people, if they want to express themselves and write a horror story related to the tragedy they went through or witnessed, it allows them to tell their story rather than taking it, right?
Let me close on this question. From what you've said thus far, but my gathering is that you made the argument that our understanding of these events, and as people, we are deeply influenced by the things that we consume, right? And if we consume horror, there's an influence there, even if it's fiction. When we watch any fictional TV show or engage in fiction as a genre, we are still influenced by it. And yet here in this segment, you've also argued in many ways that those genres are also influenced by us and by our culture. Is that a cycle? Is that something that we can expect to be cyclical?
Absolutely. I think absolutely it's cyclical. It's give and take or absorb and, I don't know, digest. Let's use more bodily terms, be creepy, right? But, yeah.
And so let me, this last question then, you're an English professor. As you go through this with your students, and given the cyclical nature of it, what advice do you give them as they consume these things?
Definitely, I will tell them, I will definitely give them a forewarning if there is something in there I think is a little more traumatic, or might inspire someone who, or not inspire, incite flashback to someone who's definitely had trauma. So you don't have to tell me what it is, but just let me know, and I'll give you something alternate to it. But I also tell them that, you know, you're going to feel uncomfortable seeing this, and that's fine. You're supposed to feel that because it's a show. Think about how often you are discomforted on the regular. It's not something you can control, but in this room, while you're watching it, why don't you learn to control it, right?
I think there's a learning process behind all of it.
Oh, absolutely.
Spoken like a true professor.
That's what I am.
In everything, there's a learning process. Keith, thank you for joining us.
I was happy to be here.
And for your insights. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Keith, thank you again for joining us. Thank you for sharing an insight. To your point, horror is something that Americans engage in on a regular basis. And it's a fascinating conversation to see beyond the fiction of it, there are real implications. And there is a real world of evil that whether we're disconnected from it or whether horror helps us relate to it, it's always a fascinating conversation to talk about those real implications behind something that we may just see as fiction.
For sure.
And so appreciate you sharing that insight. As we said from the start of the show, you are a professor of English. Your students affectionately call you Professor Keith. One of the things we like to do on this show is get to know our guests beyond their expertise. You're not just a talking point. So let me ask you this. Why teach? Why do you do what you do?
Why does anyone do anything, right? but for real, I'll be straight with you. I teach because I spent most of my life really struggling with anxiety and depression. If you've met me 7 years ago, there's no way I would come on your show. I'd be terrified. Make up scenarios in my head that are just not real, but I would be on the verge of a paranoid fit because I'm creating these false scenarios in my head. Outside of teaching, I live for philosophy. We were just talking about Hobbes and Locke. And so philosophy has taught me a lot about being calm, living being in existence under the mundane policies we inflict upon ourselves, right? We tend to blame that, project that blame on all kinds of authority figures, but it's very much an inner oppression. And if I can break that in any way I can, and if it happens to be through teaching English, because it's not about just teaching English, it's about other things, then I would love to break that, because I see people every day and I just assume they're struggling with the same thing I am. So that's what I try to do, is teach them how to break that. And for now, it's with the written word, so be it.
Yeah. And how, I mean, your students, I know several of them, they speak so highly of you. How has that engagement been with your students?
I'm honored. They are the students. For me to be good, they need to tell me I'm good. Some folks think that if I take that point of view, it'll allow them to manipulate situations in their favor. That has never happened to me. Every student I've worked with, whether they passed, failed, or went on to do whatever, I'm happy to have had that moment with them. And again, I'm just honored and so privileged, I feel, to have such kind people be affected by my teaching method, which I think is insane.
Well, they feel the same, and so thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
My guest tonight, Professor Keith Fallows, Adjunct Professor of English at Northampton Community College and the 2020 Adjunct Professor of the Year at Northampton Community College. We thank Keith for joining us, and we thank you for tuning in. We hope you'll join us again right here next week at the same time. Until then, my name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.